Hey everybody, welcome back to the Life Design Podcast. This is Michael Borland, your host, and I will be here today with Maxine Marks as co-host for episode 4 of Mental Health Mondays. And today's topic will be the intricacies and some details on PTSD. What it is, as opposed to what most people think it is a huge part of the conversation. But the reason today is starting off a little bit unique is because while recording, and as you all know, we do not script our episodes. We may have a couple of notes, but that's about it. Otherwise, all of our conversation is from the heart, purely from the heart. That being said, unbeknownst to us during the recording, we were having tremendous technical issues with the microphones, and the EQ while editing was simply not able to compensate. So today's sound quality is not what you're used to. Admittedly, it's not the worst I've ever heard on a podcast, even from a couple of other super popular professionals. But I want to warn you, I want to apologize in advance. If you can suck it up, I promise you the content, the conversation, and the things you'll hear and you'll learn about PTSD is well worth sucking it up for one episode. So I just couldn't bring myself to not put it out, even though the sound quality is not up to my standards. So I hope you'll bear with us and forgive us for this particular episode. But again, I promise the content is worth a little bit of bad audio for one episode. So without any further hesitation, thank you for being here. Thank you for subscribing and just being a partner, being part of our family here. And let's get into this.
Welcome back, everybody, to Mental Health Mondays with my co-host here, Maxine Marks, and myself, Michael Borland, Coach Michael. Today, we wanted to talk a little bit about my favorite acronym, PTSD, and really get into kind of some of the basics that will be helpful for the average person to know. So, I know in my experience, and many people that I've talked with about it over the years, most people think of PTSD as something that ex-military or maybe ex-police or even firemen deal with. And yet, though that's the most commonly spoken about, it's a small percentage of those that deal with it. So if we were to say, give us a brief, just very layman term description of what PTSD is, how would you, in your expertise or in your realm, talk about it?
Well, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a diagnosis that is given to individuals who have experienced certain life circumstances. Either they have experienced them or they have a perception of having experienced them. And it is less about what happened to the person and more about how it is recorded in their nervous system. So, for example, there are individuals who can experience really the same trauma, right? The same experience. And for one person, they may be impacted in a negative manner for an extended period of time and impacted in a significant manner. And for another individual who experienced that same accident or that same experience, it really just rolls right off of them. So it's less about the event and more about the individual's perception of that experience.
Good point. Good, simple way of sharing it. I find it funny in the research that I was doing to to be able to discuss this intelligently or at some level of intelligence with you, is, and again, I'm relaying a little bit back to, my years of experience in discussing it or even in dealing with it, is if we just listen to the words themselves, it explains it at a deeper level than what most people think about it. Post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning I'm feeling stressed because of a traumatic experience I went through, right? And I know, myself, it could be something as simple as a car accident that I was in. Could be when my father passed away, or my mother, or my sister who was 25 years old when she passed away, and how it happened. And would I be accurate from just a general term that if I went through an experience that maybe I didn't necessarily consider it traumatic, maybe I went, hey, everybody deals with this, but it's an experience that after that experience causes me stress at some level, that could potentially legitimately fall under PTSD.
It could. I think that it's important to, sometimes we use these words and they become integrated into our everyday use, and they're misused. People will say a person who is very emotional, oh, they're bipolar, or they'll say, I was traumatized by this, but were they really traumatized by it, or it is an appropriate response to an upsetting situation? That's not trauma, right? If a person says, I'm so upset, I'm traumatized by the passing of my father. When did he pass away? 3 days ago. That's not trauma. That's grief. That's sadness. That might be shock. But to actually say that a person has PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, there are very specific criteria and markers that they need to meet in the DSM in order to say that it is an actual diagnosis. And part of that is the length of time since the occurrence. So it would be inappropriate for a person not to experience and feel sadness and grief after the passing of a parent. That's appropriate. That is the body's and that's the body and the brain's way of processing a sad event. That's grief. It's not PTSD.
Good point. Okay. So PTSD, like most things that we talk about here in this particular podcast series, is a extremely deep or wide conversation to have. There's so many avenues we could go down, but the point of it is to really get the basics out there to the average person on what it is, what it looks like, take away the stigmas that are attached to it or the false beliefs and help them realize that there are things that can be done.
Right.
And a couple of those simple factors is, how do I recognize PTSD potentially within myself or within somebody that I care about? And I know there are certain things that stand out. Again, it's a stress disorder. So things that long after they happened make us feel stressed or anxious.
So if I could just jump in, I think that what you're asking me is, why is this an important conversation? Or why bother? If you're feeling upset, you're feeling upset. Like, why give it a name or a label? Am I accurate in what you're asking?
Yeah. I mean, anybody watching this show understands that hey, we're just trying to clear up misconceptions and help people understand something that is a very important conversation and way too often overlooked. This particular subject, PTSD, is much more common than people think. And I think most of us, we just don't recognize what should or shouldn't be classified there, because you know what, as you said earlier, if this is our mind, our body, our emotions, natural way of dealing with something, and we should go through it, 3 or 4 days after a family member, or a loved one passes away, yeah, we should still be sad. Yeah. But 6 months later, it shouldn't be debilitating us, a debilitating factor in our lives. So yeah, how do we know? What do we look for? When do we know to say, okay, this is more than just simple sadness that I'm dealing with?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think one of the reasons to even ask that question is to identify when we're going through an experience that is going to be sort of automated in our healing, that there's a trajectory and we can anticipate that there'll be sadness. We can anticipate that we may cry at a later date, 3, 6, 9 months, a year later. That does not in and of itself meet criteria for PTSD. It is not what?
I'm sorry, you guys know my personality, my humor. So if I still cry when I watch The Lion King, that's still not considered PTSD.
It's probably not PTSD. It's something else. I'm not quite sure what that might be for you, but it's but there is specific criteria. I know that you have some of the criteria which you and I wrote up prior to the show. Generally, the symptoms of PTSD emerge within 3 months of a traumatic event. Generally, doesn't mean that they can't come up at a much later time, but they generally do emerge within 3 months, and they last longer than a month. And I don't know that I answered the question that I started to ask before you started talking about The Lion King, but where I was going was that the importance of it is that they won't just resolve on their own if it's PTSD. Medical and medical intervention and mental health intervention is going to be very helpful in the resolution, because what it means is that something got stuck. Something happens to interrupt the automatic processing and storing and healing from an event. It got stuck with the original sounds and feelings and thoughts. Sometimes even the same smells will trigger that type of response. And so it's not as much where people often will say, oh, I had a flashback. Sometimes that is the experience, but what I find more than a person having a flashback as their, symptom of, or their suffering of PTSD, is that the experience is just sort of laying right there, like right here in their nervous system. So it isn't like, oh, it went away and then all of a sudden I'm there again. It's just always here to some degree. It may fluctuate, but the baseline of arousal, the baseline of upset, the baseline of interruption in a person's nervous system has been elevated. So that's what happens to a traumatized individual.
It literally just hit me. It is really ironic that we're talking about this today at this moment. Just last night, I was with my sister and brother-in-law, and one of the Rambo shows came on. I think it was the last one, Last Blood or something. And we actually sat and watched it because none of us had seen it before. And of course, if you're not familiar with that show, Sylvester Stallone goes through, ex-military, and he has very traumatic experiences that he went through that he deals with. Particularly, I did not like the context of the show because what it was based around was terrible. But as you were explaining that, it was making me think. He made a statement at one point that, to the effect that it never goes away, that he simply tries to control it.
Mm.
And obviously, if you know the show, he doesn't always do so well. That being said, that, today's conversation on the podcast right now is not about digging into that level of it. It's I always turn it to the mindset, and that is, can the normal person, pay attention to this sort of thing? Can we take note so that we can be, help ourselves and help others who are dealing with these things, regardless of what it is? So I know some of the notes, and I'm actually going to read them. I think I remember, but bear with me. I want to look at a couple of things. I've got it right here. It was some of the notes that I found. Some people believe there are cures. Some believe there are not. That controlling it is some of the best result we'll get. But in what to look for, what to recognize, came down to things like flashbacks, nightmares, like you just said. What's the trigger? What's the arousal point of it that brings it up? And it could be a smell, it could be a sound or a sight or a memory, a dream, and then waking up in whatever a panic state or whatever that may be. What are some of the things that, let's say it's myself, and the more we're talking about it here, I'm thinking, gee, maybe I never really did have anything that would fall under PTSD, maybe, and I just didn't realize it. But let's say I am experiencing something that every time I think about it, or I see this, or I experience this, it makes me want to avoid that situation, or it really brings on a nervousness or an anxiety or a fear or something. Outside of calling somebody and saying, hey, I want to come in and talk to a therapist about it, what are some simple things that I can do right up front, right on the spot, to recognize or maybe to help control it? Is there anything off the top of your head that you would suggest for people?
Well, there are actually tests that individuals can take. There's diagnostic testing. It's called CAST. Let me actually look up what it's called. That will help individuals to determine whether or not they have PTSD. If somebody does have it, I don't know that I would say to them, hey, you can resolve this on your own. I don't just be mindful of this or just do this. I think that there are things that a person might be able to do that can help them to regulate if they are having
like a panic attack.
Yeah, there are mindfulness techniques, there are breathing techniques, utilizing cold for anxiety is highly effective, because what we know happens in the body is that it becomes very hot, and so using cold to counteract that is often very effective. But honestly, I would direct an individual who has ongoing symptoms that last more than a month, that are interfering in their lives. I would recommend that they see a mental health professional. There are also medications that one can take, but those are very good in conjunction with therapy.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree. And my personal perspective is always work at the root of the cause as rather than try to medicate it.
Mm.
Like medication may dull it. And when we're talking mental things, and this is just my, not medical advice. This is just my opinion. I want to work at the root of it as opposed to try to cover it up with medication.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in my experience, from a mindset or a coaching perspective is if it's severe for someone to the point where it's affecting their life, weeks or months later, without question, I'm always going to immediately say, you need to go talk to somebody.
Right.
Not just your normal doctor, right? You need to go talk to a therapist, somebody professional in dealing with that. And I know from, again, a coaching perspective, which is, my area, there are coaches that deal specifically with that. And a lot of us, we come across it and we're helping somebody move forward in life. And then all of a sudden we realize, hey, there's something that they've dealt with in the past. And if they've already worked through the trauma of it and the hardcore and they're able to control it, or maybe they did heal it, maybe it's gone, it still comes into the conversation. We deal with it. And I know I've had an acquaintance I mentioned to you earlier. Warren McKee was a mentor in some ways in some particular training I did, and that's his specialty. He dealt with it, and he went through it himself. And now he coaches to people who are at the lower levels of it. And when we do, it's like dealing with, for us, stress or anxieties. A lot of people deal with that in coaching, and we deal with meditation and breathing techniques. Mm-hmm. Those are kind of the two primary, mindfulness, which, and I'll oversimplify here, means recognizing and acknowledging, and then having the proper mindset, putting aside the ego and saying, okay, I should go talk to somebody. Like, regardless of what anybody else or society may think, regardless of what else I have going on in my life, why would I allow this additional thing to interrupt my day or my life? Like, I'm going to go talk to somebody and hopefully it's something I can work through quickly, but depends upon how it's affecting you, right? Like how long it might take or to what extent you may need to work on something that is traumatizing you at that level. So we talk about this all the time. People have this microwave mentality. Well, gee, can I come talk to you for 20 minutes and you'll make me better?
Right. Well, I think one of the most beautiful ideas in psychotherapy is that it isn't the therapist that's healing the client. It really is the client heals themselves. And when we really have an understanding of how resilient and how powerful we are, and how utilizing our own insight, our own understanding to gain what it is that we need to heal and to thrive. It's very empowering. And so it isn't the therapist that heals the client from their PTSD. It's that the therapist knows how to guide the client to get the information that they have. There will be no cure, right? There is no resolution of trauma by me saying to you, oh, Michael, you're good. Like, don't worry. You're not, that car accident happened 6 months ago. It's not happening anymore. So you can feel good now. Like, I think everybody in the therapeutic community would be cringing at hearing a therapist speak that way to the client, because me telling you how to feel is not going to translate into you feeling it.
Right.
But helping to guide you through the process by asking you a series of questions that you have to go into yourself and work for that answer so that it's yours. And some of those questions may be, firstly, I mean, there's a very specific way of addressing it, and it does require having the retelling of the experience. and helping the person to not just know on a cognitive level, but on a cellular level that this event is no longer able to impact their lives in this way, that it is in the past. But it goes through, it's very methodical. It's actually a very beautiful process as well.
I'm glad you shared that and brought that up. So, I mean, again, I do not deal with that level of what should be done with a therapist. But through my NLP training and some of the stuff that I've done, I know we use like reframing, we use things like that to, as you said, literally get from a cognitive to a cellular level to where it's not just in the head, but where the body literally feels the change.
Yes.
And through part of what you mentioned, it made me remember a point that I really wanted to bring out, and that is that a lot of people fear going to a therapist to deal with something that legitimately is PTSD because they don't want to relive that experience. And it's in its own way, I don't want to call it humorous because it's a very serious situation, but you're already reliving it. That's right. Why it's causing you this.
That's right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, in your experience, as you said, there's a very specific way of handling this, of walking the client through so that it's going to be uncomfortable. Like that's part of the point, to be able to walk, to maneuver through it and to gain the strength internally to be able to handle it, to control it. And then I'll call it reframe it, or recognize that, it's something from the past. But how would you speak to the average person out there that maybe that is why they've not done anything about it? Because they're afraid to truly, truly relive it and walk through it and talk about it.
Right. I think that you said it really very beautifully and very succinctly, in that you're already reliving it. The thing that an individual may be so fearful of is the reliving of it, but they're already in it. They're already experiencing the adverse byproducts of that event. So the retelling of it allows for the reprocessing and the development of a new narrative in association with it. So the types of therapy that we use to help in the resolution of trauma or PTSD is, part of it does require a reframing of, okay, how do you feel about this now? How would you like to feel about this? There's no hypnotherapy. We're not hypnotizing people to believe, oh, this event never really happened. We're not tricking them out of it. It is their own, it happened. But the fears that were associated with the event when it happened are no longer happening. That is in the past. And so allowing a person to integrate that information that is in the past allows their nervous system to go down to a lower level of arousal.
Deregulate?
To re-regulate. Well, the problem is that their level of regulation has been, their baseline is set higher when they're traumatized. But, I use a technique called EMDR, which is eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. And that's it's very systematic. And one of the ways that we measure its efficacy is by we take a what's known as a SUDS, which is essentially allowing a person to use rating scales to identify their level of disturbance at the beginning of the session. How real does this feel to you? After we've identified what the target is, and we talk about their body sensations, we talk about their thoughts, their feelings, the picture that best describes that event. And when they have that picture and we say, okay, we're essentially bringing them back into that space, that thing, which they identify as being the trauma. And we measure it on a scale of 0 to 10. How real does this feel to you? And then through the process of allowing their own brains and bodies to do the healing, through going through that narrative and helping them just by saying, okay, literally, and the words we use are go with that as they're processing it. Something comes up, they say, I'm imagining this. Okay, go with that. But through the process, we also do some reality checking. That was true then. Is that true now? No, it's not true now. Okay, go with that. Oh, you were afraid that you were never going to get out of the situation? Yes. Did you get out of the situation? Yes, I did. Okay, go with that. And as they do that, as they go with those thoughts and that process, they start to integrate that felt experience into their nervous system.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I'm hoping that whether the listeners are dealing with it, have dealt with it, or at some point in the future come across it, that this is resonating. It is with me, for sure.
Let's go with that.
Go with that. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I will go with that. But what I want to make sure for their benefit, for the listener benefit, which is the whole point of this, of us having these conversations the way we are on podcast, is to benefit them. I want to bring up something we mentioned in one of our previous podcasts, and that is, I think it was one of our first ones on what is therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that the fear of reliving it, or it addresses that. Being in a therapy session is a safe space.
It should be. Yes.
It should be.
Yeah.
It should be. If not, you pick the wrong therapist, right? Mm-hmm. We talked about that. It's all about the relationship and the comfort level between the two individuals, or in a case like this, it would likely be two individuals. Maybe there's a third person in the room or what have you. But it's between the individuals, the therapist and the client, or in my case, the coach and the client. It's a safe space. So understand that if fear of reliving it is something that you're experiencing, that the listener is experiencing. But there also may be times where the event itself, the fear is not specifically reliving it, but sharing it. Being vulnerable to say, this happened to me. Some people, the traumatic experience that they continue to deal with, no one in their active life even knows they had the experience. And we don't need to get into specifics, but, it could have been a violent event that occurred in their life. And it could go all the way back to when they were kids, and they could be, in their 40s, 50s, even 60s, what have you. How might you speak to that if there was someone out there that said that they wouldn't be saying it, right? They wouldn't even want to admit it to themselves. But if their fear is, I've never told a soul this happened to me, I sure don't want to sit down in an intimate setting and look someone in the eye and say it. I mean, my opinion is great. Don't look them in the eye. And I'm being a little silly with it, but at the same time, I'm serious. This is a kind of a burden that people should not continue trying to carry themselves. Get it out and let someone that's a professional help you reprocess this. So what would you speak to someone where that's their situation? Their fear isn't specifically reliving it. They have recognized, I live this every day, every moment of every day. I'm ashamed or I'm scared of sharing it with someone else.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think using the word shame, because as you were speaking, I was like, ooh, that person, there's a lot of shame built up around that. And that's part of what's insulating and protecting the trauma. that shame is going to keep a person, I work in the recovery industry, for addiction, and, there is just so much beauty and wisdom in the AA community. And one of the pieces of wisdom that I heard from a colleague, he would often say, where there are secrets, there is shame. And secrets are different than something that's just private, right? Private, we're allowed to say, that's private to me. Like it's something that's sacred to me. Your shame, your traumatic event is not sacred. It is not sacred. It is
That's
harming you,
powerful.
if it's keeping you limited, if it's causing you ongoing distress, if it's impacting your ability to move forward in life, if it's impacting your here and now experience, because you're not in the here and now, you're anywhere but the here and now. You're back in that experience that happened 6 years ago when you were fearful that you weren't going to survive. But guess what? It's 6 years later and you did survive and you're here. So what would I say? I would say that shame is insulating and protecting the trauma, and it's also symptomatic of the trauma.
Wow. That is, like, I got the chills when you said that. That's super powerful. And like you said, it's protecting
It is
the trauma.
Yeah.
And why would someone want to protect the trauma? And my mind instantly went to, because it was my fault.
And I say that a lot with individuals who suffer from sexual abuse, that they often internalize it, which is so interesting and painfully sad, that individuals who have been victimized by others often internalize it, and they are the holders of the shame, when really it's the sexual predators, it's the sexual abuser who should hold the shame. Yeah. So it's very, I always say the brain is always logical. Sometimes it's basing its conclusion on faulty evidence. And so this is part of what's done, is reevaluating the evidence and reevaluating. Did you really believe that? Like, you really believe as a young child, God forbid, that, an individual who was older than you, who knew better, who perpetrated a, sexual act on you as a young child, you really believe that you are the one at fault?
Yeah.
And I hear it actually a lot, because part of the, and I'm going to get a little bit into the little graphic here, but, our bodies are programmed in a certain way. I often say, if a person is tickled, they will laugh, whether or not they wanted to be tickled. And it's the same thing oftentimes with sexual abuse, where individuals will respond sexually. They will respond with a certain level of arousal or a certain curiosity to the individual who is perpetrating sexual improprieties on them. And so they become very conflicted over whether or not they were, and sometimes they're even very curious about it. And sometimes there's a part of them that actually enjoyed that level of arousal. And so they're very conflicted about it.
Oh.
So, and that's because individuals are not supposed to be sexualized at such a young age, because they don't have the context or the ability to weigh out what actually is happening here. Is this okay? Is this not okay? Why am I so conflicted over this? And so, I bring this up because we spoke about shame and about how shame insulates a trauma. And this is one of the greatest areas that I find. I've had clients time and time and time again feel so terribly conflicted about what their part in it was.
Yeah. And I want to bring out a point. I don't mean to interrupt, but it doesn't have to be that it happened at a young age. No. I've had a few people over my years that have shared at some level that type of an experience happened to them. A couple were young, but a couple were older teenagers. One in particular that I'm remembering off the top of my head right now, but a couple were adults.
Right.
And let me make this a point. One of those was a male.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A man. Rather manly man, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this level of shame and embarrassment.
Right.
And there was and in actually now I have 4 particular ones in my mind, that I've had conversations with, and I did not work with them on those things. I told them flat out. Matter of fact, one of them was just an acquaintance, or quite frankly, a friend, that shared it with me. That being said, there was a level of what you just explained in that, as you said, they find this level of pleasure in, and I want to say this, not the experience, not the perpetrating experience. I'm probably saying this wrong, but in the physical, because like you said, our bodies are programmed physically.
Right.
Wow, there is a sensation that is in any other circumstance definitely enjoyable. How could it possibly be in this? And therefore, now I feel ashamed because how could I possibly have liked anything about that?
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is for the listener. If that is you, I'm not your person to come talk to. Someone like Maxine is. Shame is a liar. Okay. I don't even care if it is somebody's fault. If they did something they should be ashamed of by general standards. Shame is a liar. And it is something that, whether it's this type of a situation or something different, every single person that feels shame about something in their life should reprocess that. They should talk to someone that's a professional and walk back through that to eliminate that from their life. I've not found a single person that ever took the time and invested in themselves to go speak to a professional, to process through something that was shameful to them, that came out of it and said, nope, I still believe that I should be ashamed of that. They may understand that they made a mistake or that they did something they shouldn't have done, but 100% of them was able to acknowledge and reprocess shame into something that was no longer disempowering in their life.
Right.
They were able to find an empowerment in it.
Sure.
Moving forward,
mm-hmm.
right? We can't change the past, but to say, okay, here's a tool I can use. And I'm going to come back to this again because this is my area. This is all about mindset. This is all about acknowledging that I'm willing. I've got myself figured out in my head and my heart. So I say the work is always done between here and here.
Mm-hmm.
Then the rest of the world comes into play, right? You go out and you do anything in life out in the world. If you're not right between here and here, that success that you found in that is only going to last so long. And it's only going to be up to a certain level. You can never get to as high as you could if you did the inner work first. So I just think it's important that people recognize that, shame happens. It happens. And maybe it's because of a mistake that we made, but you're wise to go talk to a professional that can help you walk through that, reprocess it, and turn it into something that can benefit you and others.
Right, because there really is not any, there is no benefit to holding shame. It is not a helpful or adaptive way of thinking, feeling, being. We can feel guilt, or we can feel regret, but shame itself is generally very erosive and diminishing of who we are, and very limiting, because it is, and it's pretty pervasive also, the feelings of shame. So I agree. I mean, it does, it creates a personal narrative that is pretty limiting and diminishing and not really accurate. As you were speaking, I was thinking about that, ever so ugly topic of sexual abuse, and, what does happen when a person feels a certain amount of arousal, or that there was a part of them that was like, I was very curious about it, or whatever their thought process was. I think part of the process of exploring, and evaluating the way that we think and feel about something is having the question, well, can both things be true simultaneously? Can you have been aroused by that experience and also feel that that person went against your will, and that they were a inappropriate perpetrator, and that they victimized and exploited you, right? Like, it's important to break it down. And these are the reasons why simply saying, breathe through it and learn how to manage the stress that you feel, or the symptoms that you feel around PTSD is enough. It's not enough. It may be a stopgap. It may help a person regulate and be able to, pick their kids up from school, or make dinner, or go to work. But individuals who are living with this they are a fraction of themselves. They don't have to live that way. There are ways of greatly diminishing or even eliminating the experience of the symptoms associated with PTSD.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Before we conclude, and I know that maybe we should have started with this, but I think it's probably important that one of us go through the criteria for PTSD. What's the difference between PTSD and simply just being like upset or being sad?
Yeah, well, I think you did make some of that clear at the beginning. You were talking about the timelines.
Yeah.
That it usually would start within, a certain amount of days after,
within
months,
3 months. Yeah.
Within
Usually,
3 months.
Yeah.
And that it's usually something that that lasts for longer than a month.
Yeah.
So I know I did have some notes from your perspective, and being that you're a little more familiar with that, you had highlighted a couple of things for me. What do you think out of those? Because it all gets me thinking, and I'd spend another hour talking about it. What do you think of those would be the most important to share with the listeners at this moment? Say, hey, here's something you should understand represents level of PTSD.
Right. I think if we're going to talk about the criteria for it, I mean, I can just read through it pretty quickly, actually. These are for individuals who are over the age of 6 years old. If they're under the age of 6 years old, there's different criteria that they go by in order to diagnose. But this is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. Directly experiencing the event is one. 2 is witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others. 3 is learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family friend or close friend. 4, experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events. For example, it might be, like a first responder, or being, ongoing exposure, whether through video or picture, to a certain event. In order to qualify for the diagnosis, they have to have at least one of the following intrusive symptoms that are associated with the event. 1 would be recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event. 2 would be recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and or affect of the dream are related to the event. 3 is dissociative reaction, flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic events were reoccurring. 4 would be intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal and external cues that symbolize or resemble the aspect of the event. 5 is marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. C is persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event. So avoiding distressing memories, thoughts, feelings. 2 is avoidance of or effort to avoid external reminders. So not wanting to go by certain places or speak to certain people or see certain things. D is negative alterations in cognition and mood associated with the traumatic event. So having difficulty with your memory, persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, persistent distorted cognitions about the cause or consequence of the traumatic event, persistent negative emotional state, fear, horror, anger, guilt, your favorite, shame, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities, feelings of detachment or estrangement from others, persistent inability to experience positive emotions. E, marked alteration in arousal and reactivity associated with the event, irritable behaviors or angry outbursts, reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, problems with concentration, sleep disturbance. And all of these don't have to be there. They're just saying that an individual, they fall under these different categories. And I hope that you can actually share this in the show notes as well, so that people can look this up. The duration of the disturbance has to be occurring for longer than 1 month. The disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of function. The disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance. I guess that's it's a lot.
Yeah,
I know it's a lot.
It's a lot, but I think the reason that both of us lean towards, having these notes, wanting to be able to share, in the beginning of the podcast, we talked briefly about what do you recognize?
Yeah.
And that was a much more in-depth and a much more detailed list of these are the things. So again, what do you recognize? If you're avoiding, as you said, maybe going to a particular place because of an incident that happened there, if you're having these nightmares or these memories, these flashbacks that when they happen are, for lack of a better way of saying it, I'm gonna keep it simple. Like everything else in the world disappears for a moment because this is overwhelming to me. Like these are the types of things that those of us outside of the industry can recognize. And if we think that they're at a level that maybe appears to be affecting me, like I said, if I'm avoiding going somewhere because it brings up some bad memory and it's a memory from a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, like that means something.
Yeah.
And that's where
it could mean something.
Could mean something.
Yeah. It depends on the level of distress, but,
make a phone call.
And this is not to do, diagnosis by Google. This is why we say, go speak to somebody, because it's not your job to diagnose yourself with PTSD. That's the job of the clinician. That is why they, that is their job. That is why we're here, to help somebody identify, what it is, what it isn't, and to support the client in the path forward in healing. And there is a path in healing. There definitely is a path toward healing.
Yeah.
And it's not yours to navigate alone. That's can be very overwhelming, and especially in diagnoses like PTSD, individuals tend to flood. So even when they think about like, how am I ever going to get through this? Things feel too big and too disproportionately large.
Yeah.
So definitely reach out for some help and guidance.
Very good. Well, even after the research that I've done on it a little bit, and the conversations I've had, that really it opened my eyes. It helped me realize some things. For those of you, yes, I'll look right at the camera this time. If you're listening, if you're watching, and you feel that you're dealing with something, reach out to us somewhere in the notes or in the comment section. Feel free. We will get you resources. We will help you find resources that can help you with it. We may not be the right resource for you. One of us, particularly Maxine in this case, might be, but otherwise we will find resources for you. Lord knows there's tons of them out there. But if you're listening to this and you're hearing our voices and something about it is resonating with you, engage with us, talk with us, share it. Your story may help someone else. Your courage just to say, I went through this and this is where I'm at, or I went and got help, may be the one thing that flips that switch for someone else and gets them what they need to make that phone call, to go do something for themselves. So I do want to say this as we're ending here. The conversation that we just had, this has come up, I think, in 3 of our more recent podcasts. And that is that the terminology and the language that we use to explain something can change everything for us. And most of us do not have the language to speak to traumatic events in our lives or anything really, mental health, at a level that allows our perception of it to be real.
Right.
We're
no, I'm sorry. Now you're just reminding me that, and most specifically in this area, because when a person is experiencing a traumatic event, the language centers of the brain are not accessible. They literally go offline. So our ability to reason and to process is not there. It's not just like, oh, I felt this. Well, you felt this because it was this. So being able to use language to process it is, and it's your own language, is going to be the most powerful, most empowering, and the most healing tool possible. But that is done with a professional.
With a professional. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is a note for you and I. I want to have a conversation here in the next few weeks that is very specific to languaging. Okay. When we're talking about mental health. I think that is huge for people to understand. If we get a little bit more acquainted, if we're having an issue, if we're dealing with something, or we think we are, or so a loved one is dealing with something, if we can take a little bit of time and invest it into learning about what it may be and pay very close attention to the language of it. Don't be convinced that it's anger when it might be pain or fear. Mm-hmm. But the person doesn't know, they don't know what else to call it. And I'm going to say it this way. They literally do not have another word to explain it. And therefore they go, this must be anger. And because it's anger, then I have to act angry. And if they just learn a new word, I don't know how else to say it, to say that's not anger, that's fear, something inside clicks and says, I don't have to be angry anymore. That's not what that was.
I don't have to have all of the behaviors that I have identified go along with anger. That a person who is fearful is allowed to cry, is allowed to express vulnerability, is allowed to share. Yeah. Right? A person who's angry is adversarial, who's has to kind of buff up and man up, and that's not the case. So
yeah, and true. And I think that rides on that is a core thing when it comes to dealing with trauma and when it's at a level of PTSD. Right. And I'll come back to where we started. That's why we see a lot of people that are ex-military, ex-first responders, ex-police officers, ex-firemen, men and women, absolutely, that wind up having anger and violence concerns because they literally haven't figured out the terminology, and therefore that's, it leads them down a whole different path, and then they go talk to a professional.
Yeah.
And fairly quickly sometimes things change for them. So anyway, I don't want to keep going on for hours like I could. So as always, I appreciate you being a part of this
I appreciate you
series, and I really, really, really hope that the listeners are getting something out of this. Please, if you're out there, engage with us, reach out to us. We don't care if it's a thank you, if it's a follower, or subscription, or a letter, or, hey, help me with this. Hey, I'm looking for a resource. That is the entire reason we do this. So we appreciate you being a part of our ever-growing family here on the podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you and to serving you in whatever ways we can moving forward.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you guys soon.